We are really sorry to inform you that, in fact, there's a hole in the side of your snare drum, and we're not sure that it even needs to be there or that it serves any kind of purpose. We're going to conduct some experiments, share the results with you, and get to the bottom of this once and for all. Just to be clear, we're not talking about the holes that are drilled in the shell for mounting the lugs, or even the hole that the drum is itself. We're talking about the vent hole that's built into the side of the drum to let air pass from inside the drum to the outside of the drum when you strike it. Unsurprisingly, because pretty much any facet of drum building is a contentious subject on the internet, this is another one where there is a large group of people who feel that it must be there for the sake of sound, and a huge other group of people who say that putting a hole in the side of the drum for sound is a horrible idea. We devised a method for testing this out on the drums that we have here in the studio that doesn't involve us having to change the heads or the tuning or the snare wires, effectively meaning that we're only changing that single variable. To make sure that we've really wrung this one out, we're going to be conducting not one, not two, but 3 experiments on 3 very different drums, tuned 3 very different ways to make sure that we're not missing any possibilities. The first thing we want to do is conduct a little blind test with the pearl snare I have in front of me right now. We want to give you a chance to see if you can decipher which one is which without what you're seeing affecting your results. Just based on what you heard in that comparison, do you hear a difference between the two? Is it subtle or dramatic? Is it pitch oriented, or is it more about the overall sound of the instrument, or maybe even the snare sensitivity? Before we get into which one's which, a little bit about how we did this. In an effort to come up with a way to plug these holes that won't come off or move in the course of striking the drum hard, ultimately we carved some plugs out of cork that stay in place with friction and don't move at all no matter how hard we strike the drum. Cork proved most effective because it's a bit soft and also has a good amount of friction along the surface to hold it in place, whereas if we were to use wooden dowels or something harder, we would actually have to have multiple diameters because each of the vents in these different drums is actually a different diameter of a hole. Okay, without further ado, example A was the corked drum and example B was uncorked. Now that we've given away what's going on here, let's listen to this drum in context of a groove, both with the hole plugged and without. Suffice to say, there's not much of a difference going on between these two setups. So now we're going to move on to a different drum with a different tuning and a different setup overall to see if we can get a larger result. This drum is an 8-lug instrument, and we tuned it a lot lower and also added an E-ring to the batter head to go for a more focused, punchy, and much lower sound overall. Our expectation going in is that with it tuned this much lower, we're going to be pushing a lot more air out of the hole with each hit, so hopefully the difference is going to be more dramatic here. This drum is also deeper than the previous, which means the internal volume of the instrument is larger, so there's actually literally more air in there at all times. Well, upon initial listen, not hearing much of a difference just yet, let's hear it in the context of a groove now. Much like the first drum, we're really not hearing much of a difference. There's a very slight difference in feel with the drum plugged here, but it's really not enough to make this a thing we need to worry about. We could stop there, but let's go one step further. Let's move to a much smaller drum with a much smaller internal volume, pitch it up super high, and see if perhaps this is going to get us an effect. This little drum is absolutely cranked, but even striking it in the center, we're still getting a very similar result. If there is a difference, it's minute enough that it's really not worth spending time worrying about. At the pitch range that this drum is tuned, the feel is fairly stiff on the batter head, though at a 12-inch diameter, it's not tabletop tight. But having said that, when I hit it pretty hard, there's not a ton of air escaping out of the drum because the heads are literally not moving very much. As with the previous, if there is a feel difference between them, I am choosing to strike all of these drums in the center without rim shots in the demoing portions, and that would give us the feel change we're looking for if there was one. It's worth noting that I'm deliberately not utilizing rim shots in the comparison-specific examples because the sound of the rim and the excitation of the heads covers up what could be going on in terms of the tone, the feel, and even a possible pitch change. At this point, we're not really hearing much of a difference in sound between the vent hole blocked and wide open. I'm definitely not experiencing much of a feel difference, but if you feel like you're hearing a difference between these examples, let's try this out. 3 examples in a row and check out if you can guess which one of them has the vent blocked and which ones don't. Stick around to the end and we'll let you know which is which then. These small vent holes that we're talking about today are not the only instance of holes being drilled in the side of the drum for the sake of air escaping. In the early 2000s, there were a lot of examples of snare drums with very large ports around the circumference, sometimes many of them, in an effort to make the drum more articulate and louder by essentially letting the resonance out. It's worth also considering the phenomenon of what happens when we cut a port in the front head of a bass drum or utilize a pre-ported front head. By letting that air out, we change the response of the drum and we change the overall pitch at a certain tension compared to a head that doesn't have a port. By letting air out of the bass drum through a port in the front head, we are essentially raising the pitch at a given tension because it's allowing it to escape rather than keeping it inside and extending that resonance. This is also true of vented snare drum batters that have holes around the circumference of them. It effectively dries out the response of the drum, whereas compared to a bass drum with a port in the front head, this is at a much higher tension, so it's less about controlling low end and more about attenuating higher frequencies. We've even done a video previously about the vents in the top of our bass drum where the tom mounts live, and people had a lot of comments about whether or not plugging those with mounts or putting tape over them was going to have a super significant effect on the sound of the bass drum, never mind that those are tiny compared to the front hole in the drum. Now, on the other hand, where a vent, especially on a snare drum, does come into play is the amount of pressure that can come from smashing a snare drum, especially with rim shots, but any kind of aggressive playing. If we don't allow that air to escape one way or another, suddenly the risk of blowing out the snare side head becomes a lot greater. When we strike the batter head, we are putting in a tremendous amount of energy, even at a medium dynamic range. The snare side head, by comparison, is very, very thin and relatively fragile. With a vent hole on the side of the drum, some of that pressure can be released on the way to the snare side head, rather than giving 100% of that energy straight into the bottom head. Over repeated aggressive playing, if we don't have a vent on the side of the drum to allow some of that energy to escape on the way to the snare side head, it's going to shorten the life of that head and also risk blowing it out, exploding it out of the bottom of the drum. A large component of this issue is that we also have the snare wires to contend with that are restricting the movement of that head as it receives all of that energy from above. All of these factors can work in concert to ultimately cause you to have to change your snare head more often and possibly even blow it out in the middle of a show or a rehearsal when you don't have an extra one and definitely don't have time to replace it. Under the right circumstances, snare side heads can blow out even if there is a vent in the side of the drum if you're talking about a super aggressive player with really, really big sticks. But on the other hand, if you generally are a more gentle player to your snare drum and also don't hit it with rim shots as hard as you can ever, then maybe you can get away with a drum that doesn't have a vent in it. The other side of this equation is the idea that we are going to have more sensitivity and snare response and articulation from a drum that is unvented and transferring 100% of that energy from the batter to the snare side. In theory, this would be something we'd be experiencing at lower dynamics where we want extreme clean response from the wires, especially down low and also at the edge of the head. This is theoretically a possible thing that you could experience, and we were looking for it today when we went over through all of these drums, but ultimately any difference that we found was not audible enough to be able to be captured by the mics or our ears. This doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. This more means that if it does, it's in that realm of subtlety that is so subtle that in a performance or practice environment, it's not really worth stressing out about. The big takeaway from our experimentations today with these vent holes is that while we can intellectually imagine that this could affect sensitivity or tone or volume or some other acoustic aspect of the instrument, the big reason to have a vent in the side of the drum is to allow air to escape so that we are not forcing all of that power into the snare side head every time we strike the drum. If you want to make the argument, if you're a builder or if you're a player that really swears by yes vent or absolutely never a vent, there's nothing wrong with that. But we do need to remember that if you can't prove it through tuning, through testing, and through experimentation, then considering that it's something that has to be true all of the time, it just doesn't work. For anyone watching this episode who really feels like they can prove through video or audio, some kind of comparison, that there is a usable and drastic difference between a vented and unvented drum, we would love to see it. Please post something, whatever social media you want, tag us in it, because if we couldn't make it happen and you can, we would love to see that. Oh, right. And for the examples of the blocked and unblocked vents, it was blocked, blocked, and unblocked. Were you right about 1, 2, 3? Were you guessing? Because I would definitely be guessing.